So, welcome everybody to this ODI event to discuss the paper Rules of the Range. Just like to welcome, I think there's a fairly significant online audience who are able to join us remotely. So welcome to them too. Just for the benefit of those who are here, I have to go through some of the housekeeping issues. Just to say I'm John Plasto from CARE UK. So just to say, if there's a fire alarm, we have to go out the way we came in, onto Westminster Bridge Road. For those who can't wait, the ladies' toilets are just out there, and the gents are down to the right. Can I remind you, as I've just done, to close off that infernal machine, please. So yes, if you have drinks, can you consume them in the room and dispose of them in the room? I think, have I forgotten anything? Just to say that there will be a record, I believe, of this meeting. So it's being recorded, and that will be made available on the ODI website within 48 hours. So the process today is we're going to hear two speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, and then we're going to have a discussant. That should last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have the remaining time, which should be similar, for points from the audience, and if there are points coming from the remote viewers, which we'd actively like to encourage, because we have a system whereby comments from outside can be relayed up here. We'd very much like people, and I understand there's quite a large audience from probably largely in the Horn of Africa, who are participating today. So that would be great. So I'd just like to take the liberty to introduce myself and while I'm here. So I'm the Programme Director from CARE, but I think I'm here partly because I'm very much somebody committed to intelligent and informed programming with pastoral communities, but more particularly because we're a partner in a project with ODI called READ. I won't give you the full long title, but it's essentially a resilience program looking at cross-border issues. And that program was born, I think, out of a frustration a few years ago after one of the more recent droughts about some of the kind of knee-jerk programming that takes place in the Horn of Africa. And I think we entered with support from ECHO into a partnership with ODI, where we sought to take on some of the kind of more fundamental challenges to crisis in the Horn. The READ project has a focus on natural resource management with a lens on cross-border issues, but we very deliberately wanted to enter into that partnership with ODI in the UK to really help us on that journey of looking at some of the more fundamental issues. And this paper is one output that's come out of that partnership, was been going on for the last 3 years or so. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on that paper. It's just one of a number that's been produced through this partnership. I myself was in northern Kenya just last week. Obviously there's a lot of noise, as everybody knows, around the crisis in the Horn, but the focus was very much on what's going on the cross-border initiatives that we're partnering on, and which I think will be the focus of discussion today. So I was very excited by what I saw. I think we're going to be talking about these hybrid institutions between government and customary institutions, and I saw something interesting that seemed to be having useful contribution, and I think as CARE we're very much committed to explore whether that's a model that can have wider ramifications. I would like to say that ECHO, as I mentioned, is a partner in this, and ECHO has really kind of stood out, I think, trying to promote learning across a wide number of institutions through a partnership. There's a group called RegLab, which is a learning and advocacy network based out of Nairobi, and so I think today's discussions will feed into that rich conversation that's happening through those partners, supported by ECHO, which we really welcome as a donor that's kind of stuck its neck out to make a commitment to address kind of big issues in drylands of the Horn. So I think that's the theme that Sarah is about to elaborate on through presentation of her paper, Rules of the Range, Natural Resource Management in Kenya, Ethiopia border areas. So just to introduce our three speakers, Sarah is a research officer here at ODI. She's got a master's in development management from LSE, has worked in different organisations, including Islamic Relief Worldwide, and she's for several years been working here at ODI with a particular interest in pastoral livelihoods and drought management, disaster risk reduction and other areas, and she's been associated with this work for several years now. The other two people on the panel, I think for many of us, need no introduction at all. Jeremy Swift, long time and now a fellow at IDS in Sussex, very much one of the gurus of pastoral development in my view, so we're very, very lucky to have him here. Extensive experience ranging from West, East Africa, different parts of Central Asia, and I think currently Wales, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So a fascinating person to talk to about so many aspects of pastoral issues, and you're very welcome. And Jeremy will be elaborating on some of the themes around customary institutions after Sarah's presented. And then our discussion also, somebody who I think many of us know very, very well, John Morton, who's currently Professor of Development Anthropology and the Head of Department of Livelihoods and Institutions at the University of Greenwich, has also been involved for many, many years on issues around pastoral development, drought management, etc. Currently, he is the coordinating lead author on rural areas for Working Group 2, that is Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A very long series of words, but I think a fascinating and important area of development debate at the moment. So you're very, very welcome too, John. Okay, so if I can pass over to Sarah, who's going to present to us on her paper. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's definitely a great pleasure to see a room full. The images of unspeakable desperation and suffering that we have seen in recent months in the media are a stark reminder that the survival and resilience of pastoralist communities in the Horn has been continually eroded. And this can be attributed to a number of factors, and including some context-specific factors, which is particularly the case for Somalia. But one key issue relates to pastoralist access to their natural resource base, and particularly with regards to water and grazing land, which are both of vital importance for a mobile livestock production system. Indeed, a key feature of pastoralist way of life is mobility. Pastoralists must move. It is an imperative for their survival. And they move across the rangelands in order to access water and pasture which is scattered, often across vast tracts of land, often across international borders. And they move, for example, to access wet or dry season grazing areas. They also move in order to strategically track nutrients, and as well as to avoid overgrazing. So we see how really livestock mobility is a key, plays a key role in rangeland management as well. Now, pastoralist institutional arrangements, or in other words, the rules, the norms, the principles that govern access to water and pasture have become increasingly eroded. And this, we can see, can be one of the reasons why pastoralist livelihoods in the region have been weakened. Now, the study that I am presenting today was undertaken by the Humanitarian Policy Group, the HPG, here at ODI, and was commissioned by CARE International, as part of, as John was just saying, as part of ongoing work that the HPG has been doing in this region to support CARE International. And this study, which I co-authored together with Simon Levine, a research fellow at the HPG, really aimed to gain a better understanding of the formal and here I mean state, and informal, indigenous, customary institutions, and key actors regulating and involved in natural resources activities in Kenya and Ethiopia border areas. And here I've put a map showing the locations that I visited in this part of the world. The pastoralist communities that live along this part of the border of the Kenya, between Kenya and Ethiopia, have long relied on rules to manage the range. And these customary rules are indeed many, and it must be said that they also differ between different ethnic groups. But today I would like to draw your attention particularly to one rule, which was also shared by roughly by all the groups, the three groups, which are Boran, Garri, and Gabra ethnic groups that inhabit these border areas. I'd like to briefly talk about access to land and to the natural resources found within it. Now, the pastoralists I spoke to very often used collective terms, if you want, saying, for example, our resources, we decide, we manage. And I think this is quite indicative of the fact that for pastoralist communities, the rangeland as a whole is perceived as one single economic resource that is communally owned. Even if in the study area, this vast tract of land, this rangeland, has been divided by the establishment of the international border in the 19th century. At the same time, however, different ethnic groups own or exercise control over specific territories and the natural resources found within it. Now, we have just seen how it is imperative for pastoralists to move around, again, to track essentially availability and quality of grazing land. But when they move, they inevitably enter into the territories that are the domain, that are controlled by other groups, and by other clans, by other sub-clans or ethnic groups. And these territories may well be found across the international border. So really specific sets of rights have been developed, whereas members, for example, of one ethnic group or clan can negotiate, and these negotiations are usually the domain of elders, the right to move temporarily into the area under the domain or under the control of another ethnic group. As one Gabra elder mentioned, this is the pastoral tradition of sharing. We decide to grant access to our territory and the water and pasture found within it to others in need. Today they need us, tomorrow we will need them. So these rules of access are also premised on norms of reciprocity and mutual support. So essentially, for pastoralists, granting access to their territory is seen as insurance against the future. Now, the key points that I want to make here is that really the rangelands are not idle tracts or free land, open, where pastoralists randomly browse with their livestock in search of water and pasture, but rather specific rules and norms govern mobility and access to the rangelands. And another issue, which I think is sometimes given insufficient attention, is also the fact that natural resources management, mobility, and the social relationship of pastoralist communities in the area are interlinked. Now, the customary rules, one of which we have just seen, around natural resources management have long been under multiple pressure. Now, conflict in pastoralist areas, for example, is often attributed to competition over scarce resources. And indeed, it must be said that the existence of these customary rules, including those that regulate access, and negotiations that we've just seen do not automatically means that pastoralists have always lived in an idyllic state of harmony. Indeed, conflict is a feature of pastoralist areas. So indeed also pastoralists themselves end up breaking these customary rules. But at the same time, I think it is also important to realize that conflict can also be fueled by the lack of regard for customary institutions and elders' authority around natural resources management. Now, for example, one of the findings of this study is that in different areas it appeared that government administrators at times have pressed pastoralists to adopt a more exclusionary approach to access natural resources. In other words, government administrators have at times advised, if you want, pastoralist communities not to share their resources with others. But this, we have seen, goes against the principles that govern access to the rangeland and against really the logic of the ecosystem where pastoralists are living. And ignoring or disregarding customary institutions and elders' authorities carries serious repercussions for the peace and stability of the area and ultimately for the economic prosperity of pastoralists. In one specific area, particularly in the past, this had resulted in inter-clan conflicts or tensions across the border with renewed incidences of livestock raiding, for example. So I think that it's important to emphasize that rather than looking at natural resources management purely in technical terms, it is also important to recognize the social and institutional arrangements that ultimately determine how rangeland users relate to each other. And I think there is also another key point to make here, which regards to the numerous peace initiatives that have been promoted in the area, also in the study area along the border of Kenya and Ethiopia, by a number of actors, particularly over the past decade. And these take the form of pastoralist gatherings, peace meetings in the bush. And I think a key question here is to what extent in these peace initiatives issues around the institutional arrangements around natural resources management are taken into account in these peace initiatives. To what extent these efforts really aim at understanding and restoring, if needed, customary arrangements that have broken down, for example, between bordering communities, to ultimately ensure that peace is indeed sustainable and that harmonious relationships are maintained. Now, I'd like to move to briefly looking at formal institutions. Now, at national level, in the national policy discourse of both Kenya and Ethiopia, pastoralism has long been surrounded, this is nothing new, by perceptions of economic efficiency and backwardness. The national policies of both countries have long prioritized sedentary agriculture. In both Kenya and Ethiopia, the land tenure security of pastoralists is weak. And for example, in Ethiopia, pastoralists effectively have no land rights, and they're merely seen as exploiting free land until the state chooses to take it away. Now, the lack of recognition of pastoralists' right to own their land and of the institutions that they use to actually manage their land has very often resulted in the expropriation of vital parts of the rangeland, usually the dry season reserves, for farming schemes, for example. But in this way, by extracting parts of the rangeland, inevitably the rangelands have been disrupted, and as has been disrupted the functioning of the ecosystem. And in a cross-border context, we can say that as things stand, really pastoralists migrating across the border in search of water and pasture appear to be in quite a precarious situation because mobility appears to be more dependent on the whims of local administrators, of police, rather than on a sound policy and legal basis. So ultimately, there is no formal recognition of the cross-border nature of pastoralism and of cross-border exchanges and activities. Since the late 90s, external interventions have sought to strengthen customary institutions also in this area of the world. And a number of NGOs have established and supported cross-border committees. I spoke to members of these cross-border committees, basically in every location that I visited along the border. And so what are these cross-border committees? Well, I think they can be defined as they involve essentially local representatives of both states, so like, for example, village chiefs, and formal and customary, institutions such as elders. And they operate by really blending formal and informal rules and mechanisms in a hybrid structure. Some of those committees are significantly involved in natural resources management. Some of them, for example, have a good say with regards to access and use of the natural resources over a certain area. And some, even pastoralists themselves, have called them a modern solution or a modern approach to the management of the rangeland. Now, are they really a modern solution to the management of the rangeland? Or to be really, are they a new hybrid institution with authority over the rangeland? I think perhaps they might have a potential towards this effect, but I think as things stand, again, some key issues need to be highlighted. During the fieldwork and the analysis, it really became quite evident that little attention seemed to have been paid to issues of power and competing interests between different spheres of authority within this newly formed structure, or relatively newly formed structure. For example, it is quite difficult to see how customary representatives and formal representatives can really collaborate as equal partners. At the moment, these committees have no legal status, and their work is very much also limited to border areas. And it doesn't seem that they really have the leverage, the power, the ability to really influence upper levels of decision making and act as efficient, as powerful agents to protect and promote pastoralists' rights in the region. And finally, I think also issues of representation and accountability appear to be it seems that issues of representations and accountability would need to be better understood and addressed eventually. And I think this is particularly important if the issue of legal recognition of these cross-border committees is brought to the fore. If these committees are not accountable, or they're not representative of the interests of the pastoralist community as a whole, then obviously their legal recognition would pose certain problems, and it may risk as well to further weaken customary institution arrangements. Now, I'd like finally to come to some key recommendations that we have put forward and that have emerged from the findings of this case study. I think that there should be a full recognition for a more explicit recognition of the links between conflict and natural resources management in any initiatives really that are undertaken around natural resources management, and also in peace initiatives. What is needed, I think, is also a broad vision and strategy for supporting pastoralism in the region. And one that can also overcome the view that ultimately mobile pastoralism is a problem, is inefficient, and for which the solution is sedentarization. And regional bodies may play an important role in this regard. The governments of Kenya and Ethiopia would need also to establish policies which recognize and permit the cross-border nature of pastoralism. Securing land rights for pastoralists also to prevent the expropriation of the best parts of the rangeland, and also put the land rights of pastoralists on the same footing as those of farmers is also required. Coming to the cross-border committees, I think the roles, particularly by organizations supporting and establishing these structures, should be better understood. So their role, really, their functions, their issues regarding accountability and representation should be given more weight, as well as understanding, really, the development vision towards which they are working. And finally, I think that a key entry point for any intervention looking at supporting areas around natural resources management is important to keep in mind that to enhance the productivity of the rangeland, it is not sufficient to only take a purely technical perspective, but institutional arrangements, sharing arrangements, and social relationships of rangeland users should be understood and should be better understood and should inform any initiatives in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for a very clear presentation and for posing a number of very interesting challenges and recommendations, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But now I think Jeremy is going to elaborate on perhaps some of the challenges around institutional arrangements, etc.
Yes, could I say first that it's rather fascinating. The ODI, I'm delighted that ODI is still working on pastoralism, because by my calculation, I certainly thought about it this afternoon, I think we're very close to the 25th anniversary of Stephen Sanford setting up the Pastoral Development Network at ODI. And that's a very distinguished precedent. So it's absolutely wonderful that ODI is there working on pastoralism. So congratulations and thank you. It's really good. I've been asked to react to the paper more generally, not to the specific points in it, and talk about some of the how this relates to what's happening in other parts of Africa. I think the paper is an excellent summary based on original fieldwork of a very complex issue, and it leads us into a whole set of issues about pastoral land, and I want to discuss 5 of these. The first one is about customary and formal law. When we talk about customary institutions and how important they are, we sometimes talk as though we talk about customary law, as though for the whole of Africa there's one set of customary law. Obviously that's not the case. What we refer to as customary law or customary resource management systems are highly diverse. They come from a whole range of different sources. They have cultural origins, they have environmental origins. There is a whole set of different sources which result in different types of law. And I think it's very important. At a certain level we can talk about customary law, but I think we have to recognize that below that there are very, very different sets of law. And there are a couple of examples I wanted to mention. One is about the Baran and the Gari, who were mentioned here. I mean, the Baran, the Gari come from a Somali contract law society where the payment of blood money is the basis of a whole set of contracts, and their legal system comes out of that. The Baran come from a completely different cultural and environmental set of factors, and in the end, if one was going to work in very great detail with, say, the Boran and the Gari, I think one would have to understand the origins of the customary law. The Tuareg and Wadabi case in West Africa is very interesting because the Tuareg have been in the area of the Sahel that they presently occupy for a very long time, for many centuries, and they have a set of ownership rules about ownership of water and access to pasture and so on and so forth. The Wadabi came into that same area about 100 years ago, and their customary rules are really, I think, summed up by the fact that they avoid the Tuareg at all costs, and that seems to work quite well. But it is, one can see it as a system, I think. The customary law, as it emerged from in different forms, has been subject then to formal legal systems, starting with colonial legal systems and legal systems enacted by independent governments, and that adds a whole other complication to the customary law. So, in parts of Africa, you have neighbouring French colonial law, vestiges of French colonial law alongside vestiges of English colonial law. You have in the Gobi, to take a completely different example, you have vestiges of Russian law imposed on customary Mongolian law, and you have vestiges of Chinese law imposed on basic Mongol customary law. So this is a hideously complex subject, and I think you've done very well to keep it at a general level. But as we move forward on talking about hybrid institutions, I think we're going to have to address the issue of the complexity of the law that operates in these areas. The outcome of all this is very, very broadly is three types of regime, I think. One is regimes dominated by customary rules. And there are regimes where customary rules still dominate what happens, where decisions, I think Sudan until relatively recently, certainly after independence, a lot of decisions in the countryside were based on customary rules with rather little activity by central government. So there are regimes that are dominated still by customary rules. They're getting rarer, but they still exist. There are regimes dominated by formal institutions, and we see that in many cases where government has set up formal institutions and has in the process tried to wipe out all the customary institutions, and may to some extent have succeeded or may not. And then the third category is what we've called hybrid or mixed regimes, where formal law and formal institutions sit rather uneasily with customary law and customary institutions. And these are very much what Sarah was talking about. And I think these, my feeling is that these are tremendously important, and they're going to become more important indeed as time goes on, because they are a response to a need, and they seem to, in many cases, work quite well. If hybrid regimes are going to be important in the future, or more important in the future, then clearly there's going to have to be a process of bringing together customary rules and formal rules. And this is not without problems, obviously, because they come from very different places and they can have very different effects. One of the problems is that formal land law is generally uniform throughout the country, and customary law is place and time specific, place and culture specific, and diverse. So one is already looking at two different types of legal animal. It's also true to say, I think, the customary law is very often more complex in regard to specific resources than formal law. Formal law tends to be quite general and to envisage one system of management. Customary law, for the reasons that I've already mentioned, starts from a whole series of different points and evolves under different forces and arrives at different conclusions. So bringing together a generally uniform formal law and a generally highly complex and diverse customary law is going to be very difficult. And the only way that's going to work is through delegation of authority, real delegation of authority by government in respect of specific resources, delegation to hybrid institutions. And governments, of course, are not generally very happy to do this and won't do it, I think, particularly willingly. Now, I want to make two caveats on that process, the process by which customary institutions can be supported by formal institutions. The first caveat is very much, I think, Johan Helland, some people will know, wrote about it in respect of the Buran. Anthropologists and people like me got very excited when the first detailed research on Buran social structure and management of natural resources was published, because it looked as though here were a set of institutions, customary institutions, that were still very much alive and powerful, and which regulated particularly the management of water, access to water. And we all jumped up and down and said, this is what government needs to do, in this case the Kenya government or the Ethiopian government, wherever the Buran are, they need to support these customary institutions because they're doing the job. And Johan Helland and others since said, look, listen, hold on. These institutions that you're looking at are not just sort of something on the supermarket shelf that you can take off, brush up and apply with formal legal support. These are an integral part of the institutional makeup of Buran society, and they're not something to be handled and manipulated and changed and legislated for casually. They do have a role to play, but you have to be extremely careful about how you deal with institutions that are part of a much wider set of institutions that run Buran society. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is about the danger of forum shopping. One of my favourite phrases in anthropology, I think. Forum shopping is the process by which, if you don't get legal satisfaction through one set of institutions, there is another set that you can go to. So you can forever switch backwards and forwards, and there's a great deal of uncertainty about who has the authority to deal with a particular problem. Let's say there's a problem of animal theft, for example. You might have two fora for dealing with that. One is the traditional fora of chiefs and so on, through a traditional set of taking of evidence and coming to a conclusion. The other one would be the law of the country about theft. Now, if those two have equal weight, then people can switch backwards and forwards between those two until they get the result they want. That's called forum shopping, and it's clearly very much undermines any attempt at bringing together customary and formal institutions. The third point I want to make is about the existing potential of the formal law. I think that sometimes we are a little bit negative about the formal law. I think there are resources in the formal law that can be used and should be used as much as one can before one rejects the formal law and says we need a hybrid institution or hybrid law or to go back to the customary. I'm not sure. People have talked a lot about training of paralegal auxiliaries for pastoralists. If anybody knows about cases where that's worked, I'd be very interested to hear about it, because I've heard a lot of people saying it would be a good idea. I've said it myself, it would be a good idea. But I don't know of cases that's done. That just may be my general ignorance. Another thing that's come up recently, which I think is rather fascinating, is the possibility for northern law firms, law businesses, solicitors in the City of London, or in London, all of whom have a allocation of, or most of whom have an allocation of pro bono time, to get involved in supporting legal processes in respect of land rights or other things in African countries and elsewhere. And there are some discussions going on, I believe, at the moment in one or two of these law firms, and indeed there may be somebody in the room who can tell us more about that, because I think I would be very interested to see the impact of a very high-class London solicitor delivering a legal opinion about what the Kenya government is doing with its giving land rights to Chinese entrepreneurs in northern Kenya in pastoral areas, for example. So that there may be the formal law maybe has resources that can be used. A different type of example of the same thing is some experiments that have been going on in Mongolia now for 10 years about allocating rolling leases to winter-spring pasture. That's the difficult season in Mongolia, is the winter-spring. Groups of Mongolian families, households, who on the basis of traditional law had access to particular pastures, had exclusive access to particular pastures. The government has been making some experiments on giving them long rolling leases for those pastures. So I think it's 99 years they were talking about. Every 5 years or every 10 years, there's a set of conditions for that lease, and the government inspects every 5 or 10 years if those conditions have been met. And if they have, they add 5 or 10 years on the end of the lease. So the people who are holding that lease always have a considerable period in front of them to make plans and make investments. Now, it may be that would apply somewhere in Africa. I don't know. It would be interesting to know if anybody in the room knows what the result is of the Mongolian experiments. But certainly this was being tried very seriously in Mongolia. Now, there may be other legal models that we can think of using. I think sometimes we get too dug into our particular things and don't look widely enough outside. The fourth thing I want to say is about the general principles of institutional design, because it seems to me that we have some very clear ways in which hybrid institutions or other types of institution need to be constructed. The very first is obviously, when we're talking about pastoralists, it's about flexibility and diversity. I've said about why pastoralists are so diverse. Also, the great thing that characterises pastoralists is flexibility, an ability to change plans, change what you're doing and do something else. I think institutions for pastoralists have to be flexible and they have to be diverse, and that's absolutely essential. And that importance of flexibility and diversity will become more important with climate change. The second principle is that of subsidiarity. I think we need to look at delegating authority to as far down the chain of authority as is consistent with accountability and efficiency and so on. Because much of the problem with pastoral development has been people in government and central government in capital cities making decisions about pastoralists which bear no relation to the reality or the desire of the pastoralists. And the third of those general principles is about transaction costs. The transaction costs of the activities of formal institutions tend to be quite high. You have expensive meetings, people have to be transported to meetings, they have to be paid per diems and so on. Many other things add to the transaction costs of formal meetings. If you can tag institutional tasks onto the existing structure, customary structure of herders, you reduce the transaction costs enormously. Let's say if Baran elders have regular meetings where they discuss everything that goes on in their areas and their societies. If you can tag onto that some additional tasks, some development tasks, the actual transaction cost of the additional development tasks would be quite low. So I think that when we're talking about hybrid institutions, we should be looking for ways to reduce transaction costs. And, the hybrid institution itself is a very good way of doing that. Sarah talks a lot about cross-border institutions, and I think one of the good things about your paper, very good things about your paper, is the emphasis on cross-border stuff. I think it's a major issue in many parts of Africa. There's a lot of discussion recently about cross-border issues in West Africa and the Sahel, mainly to do with livestock marketing, or a lot to do with livestock marketing. Cross-border committees are quintessential hybrid institutions, and in the cases that Sarah's described on the Ethiopian-Kenya border, they're operating partly on customary rules, but are starting to evolve in new directions. And I think that's something that ought to be followed very, very carefully. I would just draw attention in the respect of that to the recent AU pastoral policy and the AU border programme, which might have resources to support that. Sarah, you mentioned, I think, ways of strengthening cross-border committees, but they bear mention again. They need a legal status which guarantees their authority. They must be able to cope with substantial local differences in regimes and so on and so forth. They certainly need capacity building and technical support. But those are all things we know how to do, so that'd be easy enough. Conclusions. I'm going to this is a very good empty screen, which is conclusions. I would suggest 6 or 7 conclusions along these lines. First of all, let's recognise the huge difference, the variety and variability of customary natural resource management regimes. But we're not dealing with a single, clever local people. They thought how to do this. We're dealing with a large number of regimes which have evolved in very specific circumstances and have sometimes very important differences. And if customary rules are going to be the one basis for hybrid regimes, the diversity of rules needs to be taken into account. Second, other things being equal, I believe, as I think that Sarah and the paper argue, that hybrid regimes are likely to be the most successful in many, many cases. Not everywhere, but that's what we ought to be looking at. In specific cases, how might a hybrid regime, a hybrid of customary and formal, how might that work? What does it need in terms of support? Third, however that works with hybrid regimes, the full approval of the state is going to be necessary for this thing to move forward. But it would be very foolish to think we're somehow setting up something that is independent of the state, or the state is irrelevant to this. It's not. The state will have to approve and support any sort of arrangement of this sort, and that's very important. The fourth thing is the danger of forum shopping. I've seen a lot of cases where attempts at building new institutions have been undermined by forum shopping. Just because you build a new institution, but if the old state authority is still there in some form, people hop backwards and forwards, and that undermines the institutional building as trying to do. Fifth point is the transaction cost point. In all efforts at building new institutions, try and keep transaction costs as low as possible. And the sixth point is look for innovative solutions, look for new ways of doing things. I mean, we sometimes seem to me to be rather stuck in old-fashioned ways of doing things. New ways of doing things are very often wrong, as we know, in development particularly. But let's get a few of them wrong and maybe get one or two of them right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
John, plenty to grab hold of there?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to both speakers. I've been very impressed by the paper, and I really agree with the major points in it on the rationality and the sustainability of pastoralism. Let's say other things being equal, which of course they never are. The fact that in the Horn of Africa, pastoral resilience is being eroded by outside pressures, that some of those outside pressures stem from deep and deeply erroneous worldviews about pastoralism held by governments, and to a lesser extent these days by donors. And I also agree with the major recommendations of the paper, and I very much support a lot of the comments Jeremy made. I'd like to focus maybe on some slightly more either deeper or more tangential issues. I'm not quite sure which. First of all, I was impressed in the paper by the way the fluidity of customary institutions is expressed. And this may have come out slightly less in Sarah's presentation because of the demands of brevity, but I liked the mention of rules, behavioural norms and principles. That's on page 8 of the paper, or somewhere else, customary rules and norms of reciprocity. And I think it's always important to say that there are rules, but there are also other sorts of things and processes going on. I think there's a strong tendency in development writing on pastoralists, or two tendencies. One is to assume that there is a body of rules, and that in principle those rules can be transcribed and examined, rather than looking at pastoral politics and pastoral negotiation as being based on principles which are often tacit and which are expressed in very situation-dependent ways. The linked tendency as development workers and development researchers, I think, is to focus on nouns rather than verbs. We go into a pastoral system, and we pick up on these words for council, for assembly, for right, for rule, and we don't really look at some of the verbs they're using on to confer, to negotiate, to allow, to grant. We also, I think, don't always recognise that so-called traditional systems are already fairly hybrid, because traditional actors are bringing their own resources in various different fields to them. They're people with different degrees of wealth, different degrees of connection, and also that they're people with different degrees of skill. There's a lot of skill in these traditional processes, and some people are a lot better at it than others. I've seen people, leaders in the Red Sea Hills, bring about consensuses that suited them because they were skillful operators. They could isolate people through processes of mockery. They were the people who always spoke very quietly, because when someone speaks quietly, everybody else shuts up. People who didn't carry their own stick, because you'd get that dramatic pause by gathering your friend's stick and then drawing in the sand with it. So a lot of skill, but also a lot of bringing in resources external to the political process. I think this paper goes a long way to acknowledging some of those issues. Maybe it doesn't quite live up to all the difficulties that the reality of political processes present for taking forward pastoral development and assistance to pastoral resource management, but certainly the emphasis on hybrid structures here is definitely a way forward. I think I'd also add, and to some extent it coincides with what Jeremy said about transaction costs, that we should think about something that Roy Benker said in 1994, that administrative effort, which is itself a limited resource and a limiting resource, should maybe be focused on the difficult cases, on the key resources, on the conflict areas, etc., and not on the cases where pastorists are already interacting harmoniously and we don't need to demarcate what's happening or draw lines through it. I'm also impressed by the way the paper links the two issues of natural resource management and peace, and the way it critiques outsiders who don't see that connection. I think when we look at pastoral development, we should remember that peace is not the absence of war. Peace is itself a positive state and a positive process that facilitates building livelihoods and facilitates managing natural resources to build a livelihood. I'd slightly take issue within that context, with a sole focus on the institutions over the technical aspects, because they are very closely linked, and I think we don't actually know enough about the technical aspects of range management, by which I mean the technical aspects of what pastoralists are doing to manage their range, outside some of the cases of water and also burning, which is mentioned in the paper. We still don't really know exactly what pastoralists in certain areas are doing to manage and conserve their resources. Having said all that, two maybe slightly more critical comments. One is, I think, as pastoralist development workers, we need to develop rather more, we need to engage rather more with ethnicity, which is often something we skate around. Ethnic differences they're certainly contextual, they're constructed. Individuals and households may move from one ethnic group to another or have overlapping ethnic identities, but ethnic differences are real, and they're also things that have to be understood, and the difference between Gabra and Barana as two distinct cultures within an Oromo language community and an Oromo more general cultural community is different from that either of them have with Gari as an interstitial people between Somali and Oromo, or with various other groups. And certainly the customary institutions are classically circumscribed by some understanding of what is the community, what is the ethnic group. They work within ethnic groups, and the piece of the Baran, which is mentioned here, is very much an example of that. It is specifically the piece of the Baran. And I remember Paul Baxter, who was a deeply sympathetic but also very learned observer of the Baran, saying very shockingly that Baran would shudder at the idea of raising their fists against fellow Baran, but cheerfully castrate Gabra babies. And that is not a view of someone stereotyping them from the outside. We need to look at the processes by which ethnic groups are maintained, by which some expand at the expense of others, adopt members of others, coalesce, divide, etc., which are always going to be situation specific. And we certainly shouldn't underestimate the deep-seatedness or the sheer power of ethnic difference. Maybe a similar set of comments applies to nationhood and statehood. In an area like the Kenya-Ethiopian borderland, it's obvious that national identities are very, very fluid, and there are many other cases in Africa where this pertains, in the Sahel, as Jeremy's mentioned, but also on the Egyptian-Sudan border, where people can pick and choose between nationalities. But states are still real. I think it's interesting the word sovereignty isn't mentioned in the paper. States have certain powers, both legitimate and illegitimate, and I think it's right that development workers should show some respect to national boundaries and to the authorities of national governments as they go about their business. I think also we may not always do pastoralists a favour by overemphasising cross-border initiatives and cross-border actions. This is a point that Jonathan Davis made, I think, in discussions on Karamoja, that if we go too far to emphasise the possibilities of cross-border action, we may inadvertently label pastoralists as people whose loyalties are divided and whose participation in the national community is less than 100%. So those really are my comments. As I've said at the beginning, I very much agreed to the emphasis here on hybridity as hybrid institutions as brokering formal and informal processes. I don't think what I said about the elusive nature of some of those informal processes contradicts that. We certainly need a more micro-level understanding of what pastoralists are actually doing when they manage their resources, which also links with how they're managing their interactions with each other. And we need to remember that peace is not only the absence of war, it's a positive state that allows them to do that. And yes, I believe that the hybrid institutions that you've talked about have a major role, but not only cross-border, but also in pastoral areas that are a long way from national borders, in areas far nearer the national capitals and further from the international frontiers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to everybody. I think we've got plenty to chew on. Clearly, I think a unifying theme which Sarah kicked off and everybody alluded to was these hybrid institutions, and I think themes around how we can make those work, the complexities. It sounds like there's more work for the ODIs of this world to get underneath the skin of them, but many other themes touched upon. So if I can invite people from the audience, including the online audience, to put their points. If you could introduce yourself with your name and who you work for, or however you would like to be known other than your name, and then put your point, and we'll take 3 or 4. If we can cluster them, then we will. If you want to put them to a particular speaker, then please state that. Otherwise, we'll see how it goes. So there's a microphone going around. If you could show your hand if you would like to put a point. Okay.
Thank you very much. Ian Buist, ex-DFID, now Plan International UK. I heard very little mention of water from Sarah. It seemed to be the resources we were talking about were access to grazing and so forth. And yet some of these water points, particularly places like Kadaduma, I think must be extremely large. Who has the control of those at the moment? Who is actually responsible for their upkeep? And if this is the government or respective governments, does that provide a particular way in for some elements of the hybrid committees that have been envisaged? Or is water, for instance, if NGOs are creating new supplies, as they are in the refugee areas further south, do they take proper account of to whom those are going to, quote, belong after the whole operation is finished? And are rules being looked at for that, for their use?
Okay, thank you. Over here. Yeah, we can take it on that side of the room. Come.
Yeah, I'd like to, Jim Sweet, I'm a freelance range specialist. I want to make a follow-on point to that one. There was mention made about the need for formal land rights, but a problem about legal land tenure is that it's dependent upon a definition of an area as well as a community. But boundaries have to be agreed with the adjacent communities, and that's not always easy. So an alternative is through control of water points, because this gives de facto control of the grazing areas, but permits flexible boundaries and reduces contention. Now, in the with the traditional water points, that's obviously not a problem, but it does have an implication that communities should be given both the ownership and the management responsibility for all agency and government-funded water points. This also means that the communities should have the rights of exclusion from the water points if they're being expected to manage them. This does not preclude what you were talking about of the reciprocal user rights, but they should have the rights of exclusion when their own resources have become depleted to the point that they cannot scarcely meet them for their own communities. This also bearing in mind that not all pastoralism takes place in neatly cohesive clans, such as you're talking about up in your area, but sometimes it's rather more fragmented.
Okay, would anyone like to take up this theme, or we can move on to other areas? Gentlemen?
All right, my name is Sadimo, a PhD student at the University of Southampton. I'm from northern Kenya, and one of the recommendations that Sarah mentioned was sedentarization, which is like a sedentarization of pastoralists, like making them more permanent in one area. Do you understand? Like you mentioned on recommendation number 3 on secure land rights, which is making people to live in wherever they are. And I thought, like in southern Kenya, the Maasai area specifically, they used group ranches to make people much more stable, to stop mobility. And it's widely agreed or accepted by many researchers that it made the land more private, and people are selling off the land to agriculturists, like the people who are planting like crops. That's one of the question. The next question is on the role of group ranches.
Just clarify what the question is exactly. So you refer
The question
to the
is,
issue of sedentarization.
is it one of the is it a recommended solution for institution as one of the institutional recommendation for the pastoralists?
Okay. All right. If you can, we can take one question per person.
All right.
So,
Thank you.
One final question, and then we'll deal with those. Okay, this gentleman here.
Anthony Ullman, Natural Resources Institute. Is this working?
Yes, I think so.
It is, okay. I'd like to take up one of the points that Jeremy raised on the need for state approval of institutional initiatives, whether strengthening of traditional institutions or imposition of formal ones or creation of hybrid institutions. I'm sure he's right that without state approval, such initiatives won't go very far. But how on earth does one obtain this approval in cross-border situations? For example, the creation of the Gibid 3 dam in southern Ethiopia, which is not only within Ethiopia likely to destroy the livelihoods of most of the pastoralists in the Omo Valley, but also is having spin-off effects in Kenya, drying out of Lake Turkana. So how can one hope to obtain government approval for initiatives difficult enough within one country across borders. What are the chances and what are the strategies that one can think of for that?
Sarah, would you like to
Yes.
respond to maybe the water
Yes.
management and maybe the sedentarisation point?
Yes, absolutely. If I may take actually, I'll go in the reverse order. So perhaps just to address the issue of sedentarization, which I seem to understand that you have understood that one of the recommendations is perhaps sedentarization. I do apologize if I did not make myself clear, because I think actually what I tried to say is perhaps quite the opposite, in the sense that that particular recommendation, I think you mentioned is number 3, is was actually referring to the need for a broad vision in the region towards pastoralism, and one that can hopefully overcome the idea that pastoralism is a problem, that mobility is a problem, and rather see that pastoralism and the mobility of pastoralists in these areas are actually the solution. So I certainly did not recommend, or we did not at all recommend sedentarization. And in fact, I really did make a point of starting the presentation by highlighting the vital importance of mobility in the region. So I hope that has answered your question. And if I could move to the question with regards to water. Well, actually, I must just say, definitely the paper did address both grazing land and water. I probably did not give enough emphasis in the presentation, but the aim of the paper was also not to specifically delve into each resources, but really just more to provide a broad picture of the institutional settings around these resources. Now, I visited the area for the past 3 years, and I must say that the area is very water deficient, so there aren't really huge permanent sources of water. But when you ask, and I think is a very pertinent question, of course, to say, okay, let's talk about water, who manages it? Well, for example, in a number of locations, I'll give you the example between Magado and Forole, particularly because that area in Forole, which is in the Kenya side, received unexpected rain a couple of months, if not 1 month, before I was there, and I saw the pond that camels were using in Forole. That particular pond, and that I think brings quite into stark relief the role of cross-border committees, that pond was managed by the joint committee of Magado and Forole. Magado is in Ethiopia, and Forole is the bordering community. So that particular water source, people in both Magado and Forole were referring to it as being managed by members of the cross-border committee. In order to access that particular water source, communities who were not from Magado and were not from Forole needed to ask permission to the joint committee in order to use it, and they had to abide to the rules and regulations that the committee was putting forward. So I think, again, this really puts into quite stark relief the fact that these cross-border committees do have, it appears that they do have an increasing substantial role in natural resources management in the area.
Jeremy, do you want to take up the other question, maybe elaborate on the point around water
Yes,
management?
I think it's clearly a very important point. I think we have to differentiate between small scale and large scale in this. I mean, the cross-border things that certainly I'm familiar with and that seem to come up in Sarah's paper tend to be rather small scale around particular resources and so on. And some of these may even be, I mean, in both East and West Africa during the colonial period, there were meetings regularly held between officials on both sides of the frontier.
We delineated the border.
Delineated the border. Indeed. Now that sort of disappeared for a period, but those meetings, I think, maybe at the origin of some of the cross-border initiatives that I've seen in Kenya, certainly. It's a picking up of something that had been done before and to go on. Now, that's very different from what happens about a dam and so on. And I have no answers to what you do about the dam. And this is why I think the African Union is interesting, because if anybody can cope, it would be at the level of say, the African Union. But there are a couple of things which I don't think Sarah mentioned, but maybe are interesting. One is about the whole issue of livestock marketing. Livestock marketing in West Africa now, where there's a very strong pattern of livestock marketing from the Sahelian regions down towards the coastal cities. That has been the source of a whole series of negotiations and agreements about the passing of livestock across international borders. And there was a moment when individual livestock passports were being issued. So there's a clear need for some sort of discussion, and something was anyway tried for a time. I don't know its present status. The same is true of the control of animal diseases. I mean, there's been a lot of very interesting work being done on cross-border issues in the control of animal disease. Now, what this says to me is that there's a set of activities going on which are not necessarily very well coordinated for the moment, but which could progressively, if they keep going and are further developed, they could lead to greater coordination across borders, which I think everybody will agree with a good thing. Now, that's not going to, I'm afraid, have much to control on big dams, but big dams is a completely different thing, and I agree with you. It's a rather gloomy prospect.
The final question about how you bring government into. Did you address that, Jeremy? Cross-border. How do you bring government into approval of cross-border initiatives?
Yes.
That's been addressed?
That's true. I think Jeremy is right that it's something which has to be taken
The high level.
The African Union
Okay.
level or regional.
And the interesting thing is the African Union, I don't know how many people have seen the African Union in pastoral policy. It's a very good document in many ways. I mean, it's a very, very interesting and surprising that the African Union thought fit to put its name to a document like that, and which is going to promote and push. I don't know about its border policy, but the fact that they're thinking in terms of a border policy seems to me to be excellent. So the prospect is not all gloomy.
Okay. More questions? Okay. Simon, I think you can have the floor since you're a co-author. We haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, Simon Levine here at HBG. The three speakers all picked up on the idea of hybrid institutions as being a very, very positive way forward and probably the way to go. Maybe I need to, I'm rather surprised that they saw that in the paper. Maybe I didn't read it closely enough, because I thought that the paper was I thought the paper was a little bit more hesitant about that, because John brought up the point that the word sovereignty wasn't really discussed, but I think another word which wasn't discussed so far here today has been the word ownership. And things like hybrid institutions and forum for more judicial type forums can work very well with customary ownership and so on, where there is a clear level of ownership. I've got my field, you've got your field, and we go to the customary authority to decide where the border is and so on. But here we've got a slightly different case where we're actually talking about the elders aren't just the way in which disputes get managed. They are in effect the managers of the owners. They represent the owners of the land, I think it could be argued. And in setting up a hybrid institution, the example Sarah just gave of where it was the committee which decided that people could use the water point, you are in effect negating the idea that the people who used to be would have called themselves the owners of that land now have the right to exclude anyone. Now that might be a good thing and it might be a bad thing, but it does seem to me that it's not always obviously going to be a good thing, specifically where we know, and it was discussed today, that the power relations within the committee may not be equal. And we know the attitude, I mean, for example, on the Kenya side, we know that local governments will talk about, yes, but the Constitution of Kenya gives freedom of movement for all Kenyan citizens. Yes, but it doesn't give freedom of movement to walk into somebody's back garden and pick their tomatoes. And the difference between the idea of land being owned and freedom of movement is simply not there. Whereas on the Ethiopian side, the idea that anyone has got rights, anyone has a garden at all, is simply non-existent in the constitution as far as pastoralists are concerned. So as I say, I'm a little bit surprised that the hybrid has been presented so positively, because I would have thought that it's more a possibly and hopefully a way forward, but one that needs an awful lot more caution than I heard today.
Okay, moving along the row.
Thanks. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the head of the humanitarian policy group here at ODI. I'd just like to pick on a comment that Jeremy made and one that John made. And I'll start with Jeremy, that concluded by saying that we need new models, new approaches. Well, this project, this partnership between HPG and CARE, was an attempt, to experiment with a new model. It's definitely new for us in following an operational project, closely, over the course of 3 years. And I assume for CARE to have, a think tank or, research body to scrutinize what they're doing on the ground, with several visits, really meddle in their affairs pretty much, and also come up with suggestions to change the course of the project. And I have to join John in thanking ECHO, first of all, for funding this partnership, which is so unusual, funding a large body of research in an operational project, but also in allowing deliverables to be amended on the basis of the research, because there have been some rethinking of some of the deliverables of the project as the research went forward. But I also take on board the comment that John made about the fact that we still don't know enough about the technical aspects of range management, and I think that is true, and is probably what is missing in this experiment that we're bringing forward together. And I'd like John to hear more on if you have any suggestions about which aspects, which technical aspects we should investigate in greater depth, and which partners we could bring on board to help us in the analysis.
Okay, and gentleman here.
Peter Greaves, UNA UK. I'd like to hear a few more comments about your feeling about climate change in this context. It must be already increasing the stresses on pastoral way of life enormously, and it's going to get much, much worse. There seems little likelihood that there's going to be effective controls introduced to cut back on fossil fuels globally. And Jeremy did refer to climate change in the context of increasing the need for flexibility and diversity in institutional design. Nobody else mentioned the phrase. I would be interested to know what you feel about this, what some people regard as an impending catastrophe. Thank you.
Okay. I think I'll just throw in one question which has come online just to reinforce that mechanism. So this is something I think you touched on a little bit, Jeremy. Are there foreign land acquisitions taking place in the area, or Sarah, to you? How do foreign land acquisitions impact on pastoralists, and how are institutions dealing with these? So certainly something that we see in a number of areas being a huge challenge. John, do you want to react to some of these questions?
Yeah, I'll certainly try. I think it's quite interesting, Simon's comment that he's more cautious about hybridity than the speakers. In some ways I agree, but I don't see any other ways forward. If you have traditional political processes going on, there has to be some way to link them into the world of policy and regulation. And I see hybrid institutions that can recognise both those worlds and broker between them as a way forward. I do agree about the need not to give elders who are also managers and interested parties in the disputes carte blanche to decide disputes in the way that suits them, or to exclude people. But I think that also comes back to Jeremy's idea that we must avoid forum shopping. We really do have to have ground rules about that. Incidentally, it's not only litigants who can forum shop, it's often judges who can forum shop. The elders can feel that if they're not making headway as elders, they suddenly put on their hat as a third-class magistrate or whatever and introduce a different solution, which includes sending people to prison. I've seen that in Sudan, admittedly a long time ago. On the technical aspects, having raised the question, I find it quite difficult to then give more detail. But I think what we really want to know is, when we say that pastoralists avoid an area because it's overstressed, they feel that they need to rest an area. What are they actually doing and why, and how are they interacting with others to do that? What signals are they picking up? What is their immediate motivation for avoiding an area, and how do they encourage others also to avoid it? It's that sort of micro-level interaction between the technical solutions and the institutional or social processes that I think is interesting. And many thanks to the speaker who raised the issue on climate change, which of course is an enormous topic. Personally, I'm a little concerned that and this might be controversial, that the discussion on climate change in the Horn of Africa and pastoral communities has gone a little too fast, and we've become a lot too ready to assume that what we're seeing, the undoubted climate variability, is actually a product of global climate processes. There are very different views on what the decadal patterns of rainfall in pastoral areas of the Horn of Africa have been, and whether there's truly a long-term decline in average rainfall. And then within that, there are questions about whether particular seasonal rainfall patterns are shifting. So there's a lot we don't know, and we also have to remember that the long-term forecast for long-term projections for East Africa as a region are that it will get wetter, albeit with more variable rainfall and with greater possibility of floods and those sorts of damaging events. So I think we all need to be very scrupulous in the way we talk about current climate variability. We need to remember what questions we're asking. I think there are a lot of questions where we can conflate climate change and climate variability, because they're both going to affect pastoralists. Pastoralist adaptation to both of them will be very similar. But there are other questions where we need to maintain a distinction between these, and I don't think we should talk loosely about pastoralists experiencing global climate change in quite the way that we sometimes do. Having said that, there is a lot of uncertainty ahead. We certainly need to strengthen pastoralist adaptive capacity, and in many ways in all ways, I think that's what's called a no regrets solution. By increasing the capacity of pastoralists to adapt to climate change, what we're doing is pretty much the same as what good pastoral development would be. But I think we also have to look at some of the less obvious effects that there may be in climate change, and particularly what climate change will do to range composition. And the science of what climate change will do to rangeland ecology is only at the very beginning at the moment. So those are my quick thoughts on the matter.
Jeremy, would you like to
Yes.
wrap us up?
How much time do we have?
I think we should close after your comments, Sarah.
Well, let me go very rapidly through Simon's point about power relationships within committees. I think just taken generally is obviously absolutely critical, and I think we're really at the beginning of thinking about hybrid institutions. We have to. I should have put that up among one of the issues that we're talking about, because it's absolutely clear that, as I think I said, that the customary part of a hybrid institution comes out of a long evolution in response to historic factors, cultural factors, environmental factors, and so on, and all of those imply power relationships which we can't just ignore. So I entirely agree with that. Sarah Pantiliano on new models, on technical aspects of range management, if I can answer that one. It's very interesting. I don't think we've yet begun really to grasp the implications of the Benke-Schoon's non-equilibrium environment. We talk about it a lot, some of us think about it a bit, but I don't see it reflected in large-scale design. Now, I believe there's a whole new paradigm of understanding what goes on in very dry pastures that's associated with the work of Thomas Schreika and Saverio Cratley, for example, which just takes that whole thing a whole lot further. And the science has got way ahead of the institutional design here. So yes, we don't know enough about the technical aspects, and it's getting very complicated. And it needs work on the technology of grassland evolution needs to be married up to work on institutions, which is not really happening at the moment. Peter Greaves' question on climate change. I personally think that, as indeed John said, that improving pastoral adaptive capability is the crucial thing, and that's true whether there's climate change or not. It becomes more urgent with climate change. I am something of I'm an optimist on most things. I'm something of an optimist on climate change for pastoralists, in that I think that there is a good chance that in the areas that I know, certainly Western East Africa, that pastoralists will be better equipped to respond flexibly to aridification, if that's the form it takes, or higher variability, more droughts and more wet years in a random sequence. I think pastoralists will maybe better equipped to deal with that if they remain fully mobile and their institutions permit it, than farmers who are stuck. So there may be a sense in which, if climate change does lead to higher risk, which I think is everybody agrees that will happen, whatever happens to the precise pattern of rainfall, that higher risk, if pastoralists can cope with it, and after all that's what they're doing, is coping with risk, and what they know about it, they may come out of it slightly less bad than farmers. That I think is a sort of speculative point, but I think there's something to it. Foreign land acquisitions, the question from online. I don't know what's happening, but I do know that if you go now to the West African Sahel, if you go to Mali or Niger or Chad, the number of foreign, principally Chinese at the moment, people looking at different resources and negotiating deals on different resources, many of the resources being in pastoral areas, is absolutely phenomenal. And I think the same is happening in northern Kenya. So I think this business of foreign land acquisition is tremendously important and needs to be investigated. Now, this is an area where I suspect that some good law would help, because it seems to me, from what I've seen in a very casual way, that what is happening is that foreign investors are coming in and negotiating with government over the heads of pastoralists who should be the people who in Kenya under trust land provision should have control of that areas, and the trust land provisions just being overridden in favour of potential foreign investors. So I think there is a big issue there which needs certainly more work.
Sarah, would you like to add anything?
I'd just like to pick exactly on this last point that Jeremy was highlighting with regards to any private foreign land acquisition in the study area. There weren't. Not that at least I have come across, but certainly there are other processes going on in the study area that are highlighted there and that are superimposed, for example, by governments and driven by overarching policies, including of sedentarization. But the key issue is that customary institutions or these hybrid institutions do not seem at this point in time to be able to actually do anything to interfere with these plans that might be disruptive for their livelihoods, but it doesn't seem that they are able at this stage, at this point in time, to really exert the necessary leverage to influence decisions that seem to be well beyond their control. I think that would be it from me. I think the other speakers, they have answered extensively the other questions.
Okay. I think we'll have to wrap up there. Thank you to ODI for hosting this debate, and as Jeremy said, for 25 years of debate, and I think we still have a long journey to go on. I think there are some interesting signs that you talk about the AU. I think in Kenya we have a prominent pastoral minister who many of us know, so I think there are some shoots of opportunities for dialogue, and certainly I think this project will continue between ODI and CARE, and I think issues around hybridity clearly need further excavation. But thank you to Sarah for her paper and stimulating thought, Jeremy and John for your erudite thoughts. These conversations will be online within 48 hours, including a video presentation. So we ranged broad on this discussion, and I think we will have a record of it on the ODI website today. Thank you very much for everybody for participating today. Thank you.